Hello everyone. In this video I am going to talk about the different kind of multi-factor options we have in Azure, from the free one to the P2 license one, and show you how to enable them. So there are three options in Azure by which we can enable multi-factor authentication. The first one is security defaults, the second one is per user MFA, and the third one is conditional access. So the security default one is a free one. For this you do not need any license and it's available to every Azure tenant. However, in this case you do not have any control. You simply just enable it or disable it, and it requires all users to register for Azure MFA. Also, the administrators perform Azure MFA whenever they log into Azure portal. It does not allow legacy authentication protocols, and it prompts users to perform MFA whenever necessary. So it's something like you do not have a control here. You define when a user should do a MFA. So it has its own inbuilt intelligence, and it finds that it might be a risky sign in, then it will ask user to perform MFA. As I already told, it protects admin access to Azure portal. So every time you try to log into Azure portal, it will prompt you for MFA. And for the new tenants, it is enabled by default, so you need to turn it off. So in a case when you are paying for P1, P2 licenses, then you do not want to use it, because in this you do not have any control, then you have to explicitly disable it. In your Azure AD, you need to go under properties. Here you click on manage security defaults, and from there you can enable or disable it. So for a new tenant, it is enabled by default, so you need to explicitly disable it. The second option is enabling per user MFA. So in this, the users perform MFA each time they sign in. In this we have some control, like we can define trusted locations, or we can say remember MFA on trusted devices. So on trusted devices it does not prompt for MFA repeatedly, and on trusted locations it does not ask us to put in MFA if a user logs in from that trusted location, which could be a IP range. It does not require Azure AD P1 or P2 license. It is however available with all M365 plans. So there would be some M365 plans which will have P1 or P2 license. In that case you do not need to use it. You should use conditional access, which is a recommended one. In this per user MFA, a user will have three states: disabled, enabled, and enforced. When the state is disabled, it means that user hasn't registered for Azure MFA authentication. In case of enabled, they are enrolled for MFA, but for legacy authentication they do not require app password. So legacy authentication keep on working as it is. But in case of enforced, they are enrolled, and for legacy authentication as well they require app passwords, because legacy authentication does not support your MFA. So all the users in this start out disabled, and when they enroll for per user MFA, their state changes to enabled. And when the users sign in and complete the registration process, their state changes to enforced, and administrator can change their state from enforced to enabled or disabled. For per user MFA in your Azure AD, you will go to users, you will go to multi-factor authentication, and it will open a different portal. And this is not recommended by Microsoft to configure if you have P1 or P2 license. They tell you to use conditional access. So here you can select the users, you can enable the per user MFA for them, and here are the service settings which define which are the trusted IPs from where you can skip multi-factor authentication. You can allow users to have app passwords for legacy apps. You can also block that. What all methods are available for multi-factor authentication, and this allows users to remember MFA on devices they trust days before a device must re-authenticate. So on a device, if they have entered MFA, then for the next 7 days they will not be prompted on that same device. The third one is conditional access, which requires P1 license at a minimum. or P2 license if you want to use risk-based conditional access. So I have created a video for this as well, for which I will paste the link in the description. It requires modern authentication to be turned on for all the applications and require per user MFA to be turned off. So we saw per user MFA in the previous slide, so that has to be turned off and all your authentication should be modern. So how do we check whether we have modern authentication enabled for all the apps? In order to do that, we will go to our AD, and in AD we will click on sign ins. Under sign in we will add a column called client app, and under client app we can see if we have any application which is using legacy authentication. So if there is any application which is using legacy authentication, we will have to move that to support modern authentication before we enable conditional access with MFA, because they do not support MFA. So the people who are targeted with the conditional access policy will perform registration for MFA when they sign in for first time. For example, you have put in a conditional access policy wherein it requires users to do MFA if they are not logging in from trusted locations, which is your office location. So until unless a user signs in from a non-trusted location, they will not be prompted to set up the registration for MFA. However, if you have a P2 license, you can force users to perform registration. So how you can force them? You can go to security, go to identity protection, go to MFA registration policy. You can select the users here and enforce a policy on them to register for MFA. But this requires P2 license. Otherwise, you have conditional access, which is a recommended one. So you create conditional access policies here, and under the granting condition, you select that user requires some multi-factor authentication. So once these conditions are met, user is required to do multi-factor authentication, and then they will register and provide the MFA. I hope you found this video informative. So these were the three options in Azure for Azure MFA from free to P2, and I will see you in my next video. Please like and subscribe to my channel. Bye bye.